Greetings, traveler. I see you have ventured once more into the YouTube wasteland in search of content. But wait, before you give up and return to the same 3 channels as always, stay a while and listen. Let me regale you with a story from the mythical and long-forgotten era of the mid-2000s. Back then, there was a company called Silicon Knights, known throughout all the realms as great heroes of the games industry. Producers of magnificent titles such as Blood Omen, Legacy of Kain, Metal Gear Solid, The Twin Snakes, and most of all, Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem. But alas, they were met with a tragic fate, brought low by their own hubris like the Greek heroes of legend, by challenging a titan, Epic Games. This is the tale of how one company, once beloved and successful, was brought down to bankruptcy and disgrace by their own hands. This is the story of gaming's most ridiculous lawsuit ever. Sorry, not quite sure what came over me there, but anyway, let's start with some background on Silicon Knights themselves. Founded in 1992 by one Dennis Dyack in Ontario, Canada. They found their footing producing strategy and RPG games for DOS, none of which are really worth talking about here though, since they were all basically alright by the standards of people in the early 90s, but are fucking unplayable by the standards of today.
You pop this piece of crap in, and what do you get? Well,
Silicon Knights only truly hit it big when they developed their wildly successful title, Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, published by Crystal Dynamics in 1996. The first game in the incredibly confusingly titled Legacy of Kain series. The game was a hit. It was hugely popular and outsold all of the developers' expectations for the title, and was loved by fans and critics alike. After the game's release, however, Dennis does an oopsie and practically single-handedly ruins his company's relationship with their publisher Crystal Dynamics. When asked in an interview if Silicon Knights would continue to work with Crystal Dynamics, Dennis responded with, quote, "This is extremely unlikely for many reasons that I cannot go into." And just what an absolute disaster of a statement that was. So, to nobody's great surprise, Crystal Dynamics immediately dissolved their relationship with Silicon Knights. And as it turns out, the people that owned the rights to the Legacy of Kain were Crystal Dynamics, and not Silicon Knights. Which means they were the ones who got to make all of the wildly successful and very profitable sequels to Blood Omen Legacy of Kain. Meanwhile, Silicon Knights got to eat shit. Fortunately though, Silicon Knights had managed to impress Nintendo, and they would go on to create their next 2 games for Nintendo's most adorable console, the GameCube.
What I like to call the Nintendo Shit Cube.
Firstly, they produced Eternal Darkness, Sanity's Requiem, which went on to be a massive critical success, but unfortunately only sold just barely okay despite all of its awards. They followed this up with Metal Gear Solid: The Twin Snakes, continuing in Silicon Knights' traditions of A, critical acclaim, and B, colons in the titles of their games. This time though, the game actually sold well too, and this put them in a great position, and meant Dennis could pursue his dream project, a game called Too Human. Dennis had been kicking around ideas for this game he called Too Human for a long time now, since even before the development of Blood Omen Legacy of Kain, and they'd even announced it back in 1999 as a title for the original PlayStation, although development was always put on the back burner while Silicon Knights focused on their other projects. But now was the time for Too Human. By 2005, Silicon Knights had reconsidered their relationship with Nintendo and had found a much more attractive offer from Big Daddy Microsoft, revealing at E3 2005 that they would be releasing all of their new games for the next console generation exclusively on Microsoft's Xbox 360. And alongside this came the return of Too Human, revealed this time as an epic trilogy. Too Human was to be a third-person, sci-fi, action role-playing game inspired by Norse mythology, and was set to feature epic battles, a powerful story, and up to 4 simultaneous players in co-op multiplayer. Initially slated for release in 2006, the game was hotly anticipated, and there was good reason for fans to be hyped. Although Silicon Knights weren't exactly the most prolific developers with only 3 titles in the last decade, those games had all gone on to receive critical acclaim and build cult followings. And so the studio had gained a loyal audience eager to play their next release. Unfortunately though, things weren't going to turn out all that great for anybody involved, whether that be the fans, Microsoft,
Merry Christmas, Xbox,
or Silicon Knights. You see, when Silicon Knights had announced their partnership with Microsoft, they'd also announced one other partnership, this time with Epic Games, to use their brand spanking new Unreal 3 engine for all of their games for this console generation. And shortly after development began, Silicon Knights started to regret this decision. Turns out that Unreal 3 wasn't quite finished yet, something that had been made clear to Silicon Knights when they'd originally licensed the engine, but they hadn't anticipated it being quite as big of a problem as it was turning out to be. And as development progressed, these issues only became more and more apparent. Eventually, after around 2 years of work on Too Human, Silicon Knights turned around and sued Epic Games on July 19th, 2007. Silicon Knights alleging in their suit that, quote, rather than provide support to Silicon Knights and Epic's other many licensees of the engine, Epic intentionally and wrongfully has used the fees from those licenses to launch its own game to widespread commercial success, while simultaneously sabotaging efforts by Silicon Knights and others to develop their own video games. Essentially, they're saying Epic took money for an unfinished product, and then rather than using that money to actually finish the product they were paid for, they spent it all on Gears of War instead. And so the legal shitshow got underway, but as always with the American court system, it took fucking forever to actually get anywhere. And in the meantime, Too Human was finally finished off and ready for release in August of 2008. Roughly 2 years behind schedule, but hey, better late than never, right? Well, unfortunately for Silicon Knights, the game was not the smash hit they were hoping for. I remember playing it around 2009 or so when I was a wee lad, and even then I thought it was shit. And I was just an idiot kid who would eat up anything put in front of him. The gameplay was repetitive and dull, the controls were infuriating and broken, and holy shit, every single time you die, you have to watch this incredibly long animation of a Valkyrie pick your useless ass up off the floor and fly you to Valhalla before you finally respawn. Here, let's finish watching the whole thing in real time. Still going. Still going. Still going. Still going. There we go, she's finally picked us up. And now we're done. That just took 28 seconds of your life. Now that's fine for me because I'm a chronic failure at life sitting here making YouTube videos, but you probably have real things you need to be doing. So imagine watching this animation every time you die, and you will die quite a bit until you get used to these weird controls. Still, I do have to say that as a man-child as opposed to an actual child, I can see there are redeeming qualities to the game. There are interesting builds you can pick, there's a good variety of loot to choose from, and holy shit, the music is fantastic, but ultimately, at the end of the day, none of it is enough to really get away from the all-encompassing clunky feeling you get both from these really awkward user interfaces and the weird control scheme. What might have made the game bearable was the 4-player cooperative play that was promised, both local and online, but that ended up being cut down to just 2 players and only online, which was a major disappointment for many. Although I'll stop talking about the game too much since it's not really the focus of the video. Suffice to say though that while some people certainly did enjoy it, and I can see that the game does have some merits, it didn't perform nearly as well as it needed to for a $60 to $100 million video game. Things were not good, and the sales figures came in well below what Silicon Knights, and more importantly Microsoft, were anticipating.
Where's my fucking money, Denny?
This compounded the significant financial strain Silicon Knights were under, and ended their relationship with Microsoft. Silicon Knights now desperately needed to win their case against Epic Games, both to save their reputation and to recoup some of their massive financial losses. As it turns out though, things were not as simple as Silicon Knights made it appear in their initial allegations. Which of course brings us back to the lawsuit. Silicon Knights alleged that due to the non-functional and incomplete engine provided by Epic, that they were forced to create their own engine, making the game more expensive, taking longer, and resulting in the cutting of features like the 4-player co-op. Okay, so how much more expensive are we talking? Well, Silicon Knights brought in a financial analyst called Terry Lloyd. Lloyd claims Silicon Knights had incurred over $58 million in damages based on lost royalties, publisher bonuses, profits from potential sequels and future projects, and the studio's additional cost in developing a new engine and the economic harm that their reputation had suffered. A number that Epic described in court as, quote, unreliable, speculative, and made up. Turned out that the North Carolina district judge agreed with Epic and threw that number out almost immediately. And Silicon Knights was required to submit a new breakdown of damages that was less speculative and more based on fact. Still, despite this setback, Dennis was still confident that Silicon Knights would win the trial, stating in an interview that this would be, quote, one of the few rulings that Epic can say went their way. But as years and years of legal battles dragged on, Silicon Knights could never quite figure out how much they wanted in damages, and as the trial finally got underway in 2012, the judge had had enough and decided for them. Silicon Knights would be entitled to a grand total of $1.
What the fuck?
While not a determination of guilt, it certainly created a new problem for Silicon Knights, meaning that even if they won the trial, they would have to hope that they were able to successfully appeal the damages amount. But before they could get into that, they had to deal with their own lawsuit, which was currently falling apart around them. Because the licensing agreement that Silicon Knights had signed off on with Epic back in 2005 was actually pretty clear. The engine was provided, unfinished, and wasn't necessarily fit for the purposes that Silicon Knights had in mind. And while Epic had stated that they would try to have the fully functional engine working for the Xbox 360 6 months after the development kits were finalized, this was in no way legally binding. And while Epic's support had certainly not been ideal, it was in line with the contract that Silicon Knights had agreed to. And there was no evidence to show that Epic had been siphoning funding from Unreal 3 development and putting it into their own games. That was purely speculation on Silicon Knights' part, and Silicon Knights' claims were ultimately dismissed. They got nothing.
You get nothing! You lose! Good day, sir!
In fact, it was worse than nothing, because Silicon Knights had been countersued by Epic. They'd kicked the hornet's nest, and were about to be stung. Because when Silicon Knights had said they were forced to develop their own engine, what that actually meant was they'd gone and copy-pasted thousands and thousands of lines of code straight out of Unreal 3.
What?
Obviously, that's not legal at all, and hilariously enough, what gave them away was the fact that they'd included internal comments left by Epic's programmers, typos and all. All they'd done was remove Epic's copyright notice from the bottom and replace it with their own in a desperate attempt to hide their blatant theft. This was immediately discovered upon examination of Silicon Knights' engine, and the judge went as far as to describe the evidence against them as, quote, overwhelming. And so the court ruled in Epic's favour on all counts. And while they were awarded $4.45 million, they'd actually only sought $650,000. And even then the judge decided that $4.45 million wasn't enough, and doubled it to $9 million. And to top it all off, Silicon Knights was ordered to immediately recall and destroy all copies of 2 Human and X-Men Destiny at their own expense, as well as cancel and destroy all work that had been done so far on 3 upcoming titles they were developing.
Stop! He's already dead!
Surprisingly, Silicon Knights managed to still struggle on for another 2 years, but at this point there was not much they could do to salvage their situation, and on May 16th, 2014, Silicon Knights filed for bankruptcy. And so did Icarus fall. They flew too close to the sun and paid the price. And that's the end of our story for today. Thanks as always for watching one of my shitty videos. If you stuck around to the end, I apologize for all the time I just took from your life that you will never get back. Please be sure to unsubscribe and call me mean words in the comments. Stay safe out there.